This is an ABC podcast.
Hello and welcome to this week's Health Report with me, Norman Swan.
And me, Tegan Taylor.
Today, a pretty devastating study on the value of common orthopaedic operations and procedures. A better way of treating high blood pressure, according to Australian research.
The benefits of exercise for your eyes. And over the past 18 months, science has been scrambling to make sense of the pandemic. How much do lockdowns help or harm? Now, a new report has drawn together data from multiple sources to provide a snapshot of how Australia fared through its first year with COVID-19. The report from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare paints a mostly positive picture. Compared with countries with a similar population mix and health systems, there are tens of thousands of Australians alive today who would not have been if we'd had a similar death rates to, say, Canada, Sweden or the UK. But the lockdowns that saved those lives have had other effects, good and bad, and the pandemic has not treated segments of Australian society equally. Here to talk about the report is its author, Dr. Linnell Moon. Welcome, Linnell.
Thanks very much, Tegan.
So let's start with the good news. Lives have been saved from COVID, as we said, but we've also seen lives saved from other sources, some a bit unexpected.
So there were certainly some positive impacts from the restrictions that needed to be put in place. And overall, our death rates were lower than the average over the previous 5 years. But then specific causes of death stood out. One of those was respiratory infections, where death rates were significantly lower than previous years.
Like
and another area, exactly, yes. And another area where death rates were much lower was road deaths, where there was 25% fewer road deaths in April 2020 compared with the same month in the previous year.
Is that just because people weren't moving around as much?
Yes, I would say that's exactly why.
So that's the good news, but there was also costs to lockdown. Mental health, which was one of the big ones that I think a lot of people were looking at. Issues went up, but then they've sort of stabilised. But what other costs might there have been, for example, people missing other diagnoses because they, say, weren't engaging with the healthcare system as much as they would have because of fear of being infected?
Yes, that's right. So there's certainly quite a disruption to the health system in many ways, both in terms of how services could be delivered because of potentially increased risk of infection from the virus. But also people may have been reluctant or more reluctant to come forward for treatment. So we did look at Medicare data to try and get a handle on this. And what really stood out was how important the new telehealth provisions were. For example, there was around 36% of GP presentations were delivered by telehealth in April 2020, and similar high proportions for, say, mental health services as well.
Does telehealth do as good of a job as a face-to-face consultation?
That's a good question, and that's not something we've looked at. But I think in terms of it's certainly better than not having any consultation at all.
Are there other things that might not be able to be noticed yet? So, people, maybe they're exercising less or more, or maybe they're eating or drinking more than they would have. We might not see these health effects for a few years. Yes. So we did look at available data on health behaviours, and the picture is actually quite mixed. So in terms of physical activity, around about 21% of people increased their physical activity in June 2020 compared with what was their usual pattern before the pandemic. But also a similar proportion, about 19%, decreased it. So it looks like it's a different pattern for different people. Right, so it's one of those things where the average is maybe disguising the fact that there are changes happening under the surface. And we should note that the timeframe for this report that you've put out is the start of the pandemic to maybe April and May this year. So it's not including this latest wave that began in June this year, which I suppose will be captured in a future report that you'll put out. But can you talk about the uneven distribution of, we've had a relatively easy run through the pandemic compared to other countries, but that burden hasn't been evenly distributed across the country.
No, that's exactly right. So we had data on some population groups, but not all. We certainly were able to look at the situation for people who reside in residential aged care facilities. And while they accounted for around 7% of cases, they also accounted for 75% of deaths. Another group that we could look at was aged care workers, and it was estimated that they were about 2.7 times as likely to contract the disease than the general community. And then the other thing that we were able to look at, which was really new analysis for this report, was the impact across socioeconomic groups. So using deaths data held by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, we were able to put those deaths into socioeconomic groups. And from that, we could see that there was 4 times as many deaths in the lowest socioeconomic group compared to the highest. And then when we adjusted, and then when we turned it into a rate, an age standardised rate, the risk for the people in the lowest socioeconomic group was 2.6 times that of the people in the highest group.
So, okay, so that's one group, and they're feeling that burden more strongly. Are they perhaps getting vaccinated at higher rates a bit to sort of make up for this?
Yeah, so we haven't got data on vaccination rates in the report. It's certainly something that we'd like to look at in a future report. The sort of things we can say about the socioeconomic patterns is that it could be a combination of people having a higher risk of contracting the virus in the first place. For example, if they're less able to work from home, for example, and they have to travel to work, increasing their risk. But then, on the other hand, they could also have an increased risk of dying if they do contract the virus. And we do know that chronic diseases, which are a risk factor for more severe COVID-19, the chronic diseases have a higher prevalence in the lower socioeconomic groups than in the higher socioeconomic groups.
Thanks so much, Linnell.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Linnell Moon is an epidemiology advisor at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Now, we're constantly told how good exercise is for us. It builds muscle, it strengthens our bones, it helps our heart stay healthy, as regular health report listeners know. But the effects of exercise stretch beyond just your muscles, and they actually reach your brain and possibly even your eyes and retina, because exercise sends molecular messages that are only starting to be understood by the medical community. Some researchers believe they contain information that could develop a therapy for complex neurodegenerative diseases. One of these researchers is Dr. Josh Chu-Tan, a medical researcher at the John Curtin School of Medical Research and ANU Medical School. He's one of this year's ABC Top 5 scientists, and he's here to talk to us right now. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Tegan. How are you?
Good. So how does exercise work in the sense of it could actually help your brain and your eyes?
Yeah, so it's a good question to start with, because we actually don't fully understand yet why this is. I mean, as you said, how can something that is causing, affecting primarily your muscles be actually affecting your brain and then potentially your eyes and your kind of neuronal health in general? Well, there's actually been quite a few landmark studies that have occurred since the turn of the century that have demonstrated that our muscles actually act like an endocrine organ. So now your endocrine organs, the endocrine system, that is the collection of organs that is responsible for releasing hormones, so to control a whole bunch of mechanisms throughout our body. So to give a few examples of that, we have, say, your thyroid gland, which helps with growth, energy expenditure. You have your pancreas, which can release insulin, and obviously that helps control our blood sugar, adrenal gland, which helps control stress, just to name a few. So it was a pretty big deal when it was discovered that your muscles actually act in a similar way. And they actually also release signals during exercise that travels around our blood circulation, that carries messages to the rest of our body, including the brain and very likely the retina. Now, we work on the retina, which is the tissue that lines the back of our eye and is responsible for pretty much our vision. All right. So specifically, though, we work on a disease known as age-related macular degeneration. And it's a neurodegenerative disease similar to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, et cetera. And it's the leading cause of blindness in the developed world. right? So it affects your central vision, pretty much all of our useful vision. The problem is 1 in 7 Australians and New Zealanders over the age of 50 will develop AMD at some point in time. And really right now, there is absolutely nothing that we can do for the most common form of it. The form that accounts for, I'd say, approximately 90% of all AMD patients. Right. And I actually recently spoke to Jan James, who has early AMD, about how her life has changed since she found out about her diagnosis.
It was a shock because I thought, I don't think there's going to be any way out of this. I'm going to have to plan my life, my future life, to take into consideration how am I going to get around when I can't drive, those sorts of things. I can't see animals or birds at a distance like I used to. And I used to pick out the kangaroos and things on the hill. Well, I don't see them as much now.
So that was Jan James talking about her experience with age-related macular degeneration. What do we know so far about what can be done for AMD, and how can exercise actually help?
Yeah, so the problem is there's not much that can be done. There's 2 forms. There's the wet form, which there is a therapy for, but the dry form, like I said earlier, that accounts for 90% of the patients, there's nothing that can be done, right? So once you have it, you kind of just have to wait and let it progress, right? And that's the problem with all neurodegenerative diseases currently, is that they're all incredibly complex. They're all multifactorial, as we call it, which means that there's a lot of moving parts to it. So if you were to try and target just one part of it, it's very likely that something else will come along and take its place, end up causing a similar effect, end up causing the same disease progression, right? So to develop a true therapy for these diseases, such as AMD, you do need something that is multi-targeted. You need something that is comprehensive, that is holistic, that can affect a wide range of what eventually leads to the progression of the disease. And that's where we are hypothesizing that maybe exercise can hold the key to this, right? Maybe exercise can be a natural and, I'll say in inverted commas, holistic therapy that can hold the key to a lot of these disorders.
Okay, so the exercise is releasing hormones, like you said, the muscles are doing that job as an endocrine organ, but how do you actually harness this, and what's the time frame that we're looking at? Because people have been exercising for a long time, they still get AMD.
For sure. And it's not, they're not releasing hormones per se, but they're releasing signals. And these signals, these messages, they are being carried in what are known as extracellular vesicles, right? It's a very hot topic in medical research right now because of the messages that they contain, because of the way that they can communicate across the rest of our body. So what we're looking at and interested in is what is in these carriers. So specifically, what is the message that the muscles seem to be releasing every single time that we exercise that ends up reaching our brain and our eye. The problem here is that these neurodegenerative diseases, they're all age-related, right? They're all age-related. And, we're not talking about artificial exercise. We're talking about trying to isolate this molecular message of exercise and the actual carriers that they're in, so that we can potentially, artificially stimulate these benefits of exercise to people who physically might not be able to exercise to the extent that is needed to see these benefits to our brain and our eye health.
So very briefly, Josh, what's the time frame here? 5 years, 10 years, 50 years before someone would be getting this as a treatment?
Yeah, well, we're looking at a decent amount of time. Scientific and medical research takes a long time. It has to be reiterated. So I'm talking more than 10 years. This is research that is currently ongoing, but we are hopeful that even the information that we find from this will potentially help lay the foundation, at least, for these multi-targeted therapies that we really need.
Well, we're watching with interest. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thank you, Tegan.
Dr. Josh Chutan from the John Curtin School of Medical Research and ANU Medical School, one of this year's ABC Top 5 scientists.
Research published in the British Medical Journal has seriously questioned the effectiveness of the 10 commonest orthopaedic operations and procedures. Evaluating the evidence behind some shoulder and wrist surgery, knee reconstruction, spinal surgery and joint replacements, among others, they couldn't find strong evidence that these procedures and others were any more effective than non-surgical treatment. Someone who's done similar studies and carried out orthopaedic trials himself is Ian Harris, who's Professor of Orthopaedic Surgery at the University of New South Wales. Welcome back to the Health Report, Ian.
Thanks for having me, Norman.
So, to be specific, I'll just read them out. The procedures they looked at were arthroscopic, that's the arthroscopic anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction, knee reconstruction, arthroscopic meniscal repair, that's repairing your cartilage, arthroscopic partial meniscectomy, so that's doing a little bit of a tear on the cartilage, arthroscopic rotator cuff repair, that's a shoulder surgery, arthroscopic subacromial decompression, also shoulder surgery, carpal tunnel decompression, that's in your wrist, lumbar spine decompression, lumbar spine fusion, total hip replacement and total knee replacement. I mean, that's just about everything that orthopaedic surgeons do.
That's certainly a big part of it. Yeah, that would be by far the majority of what we do. Yeah.
So when they looked for published evidence according to clinical trials, what did they actually find?
They looked at, it was a review of reviews. So they looked at systematic reviews of randomized trials. And they concluded that there was evidence supporting two of those procedures, which was carpal tunnel decompression, which is a very common procedure, and total knee replacement, which is an extraordinarily common procedure. And for the others, there was either no evidence. So for some of those things, there were no trials being done, so like meniscus repair. And for the others, the evidence was that it was not beneficial compared to not doing it.
Meniscal repair is one of your favourite things because the average person over 55 has a tear in the meniscus without knowing it, even whether they've got knee pain or not.
Yeah, meniscal repairs have become very common over recent times. Previously, nearly all meniscus tears were removed when evidence showed that removing them, particularly for degenerative tears, which is most tears, doesn't work. Surgery for that has declined. But more and more surgeons are looking to repair the meniscus, to sort of sew it back together again, which may be very good in a fresh, large tear in a young person. But as the sort of the limits of the surgery get pushed, it gets done in rattier looking tears in older people.